My terms are only 5 shillings a lesson, she went on, in her louder tone. I'm sure that's not much, Mr. Bashwood. I give such long lessons, and I get all my pupils' music half price. She suddenly dropped her voice again, and looked him brightly into instant subjection. Don't let Mr. Armadale out of your sight tomorrow. If that girl manages to speak to him, and if I don't hear of it, I'll frighten you to death. If I do hear of it, I'll kiss you. Hush! Wish me good night, and go on to the town, and leave me to go the other way. I don't want you. I'm not afraid of the man behind the houses. I can deal with him by myself. Say good night, and I'll let you shake hands. Say it louder, and I'll give you one of my flowers, if you'll promise not to fall in love with it. She raised her voice again. Good night, Mr. Bashwood. Don't forget my terms. 5 shillings a lesson, and the lessons last an hour at a time, and I get all my pupils' music half price, which is an immense advantage, isn't it? She slipped a flower into his hand, frowned him into obedience, and smiled to reward him for obeying. At the same moment, lifted her dress again above the impurities of the road, and went on her way with a dainty and indolent deliberation, as a cat goes on her way when she has exhausted the enjoyment of frightening a mouse. Left alone, Mr. Bashwood turned to the low cottage wall near which he had been standing, and resting himself on it wearily, looked at the flower in his hand. His past existence had disciplined him to bear disaster and insult, as few happier men could have borne them. But it had not prepared him to feel the master passion of humanity for the first time at the dreary end of his life, in the hopeless decay of a manhood that had withered under the double blight of conjugal disappointment and parental sorrow. "Oh, if I was only young again!" murmured the poor wretch, resting his arms on the wall and touching the flower with his dry, fevered lips, in a stealthy rapture of tenderness. "She might have liked me when I was 20." He suddenly started back into an erect position, and stared about him in vacant bewilderment and terror. "She told me to go home," he said, with a startled look. "Why am I stopping here?" He turned and hurried on to the town, in such dread of her anger, if she looked round and saw him, that he never so much as ventured a backward glance at the road by which she had retired, and never detected the spy dogging her footsteps under the cover of the empty houses and the brick heaps by the roadside. Smoothly and gracefully, carefully preserving the speckless integrity of her dress, never hastening her pace, and never looking aside to the right hand or the left, Miss Gwilt pursued her way toward the open country. The suburban road branched off at its end in 2 directions. On the left, the path wound through a ragged little coppice to the grazing grounds of a neighboring farm. On the right, it led across a hillock of wasteland to the high road. Stopping a moment to consider, but not showing the spy that she suspected him by glancing behind her while there was a hiding-place within his reach, Miss Gwilt took the path across the hillock. "I'll catch him there," she said to herself, looking up quietly at the long straight line of the empty high road. Once on the ground that she had chosen for her purpose, she met the difficulties of the position with perfect tact and self-possession. After walking some 30 yards along the road, she let her nosegay drop, half turned around in stooping to pick it up, saw the man stopping at the same moment behind her, and instantly went on again, quickening her pace little by little, until she was walking at the top of her speed. The spy fell into the snare laid for him. Seeing the night coming, and fearing that he might lose sight of her in the darkness, he rapidly lessened the distance between them. Miss Gwilt went on faster and faster, till she plainly heard his footstep behind her, then stopped, turned, and met the man face to face the next moment. "My compliments to Mr. Armadale," she said, "and tell him I've caught you watching me." "I'm not watching you, miss," retorted the spy, thrown off his guard by the daring plainness of the language in which she had spoken to him. Miss Gwilt's eyes measured him contemptuously from head to foot. He was a weakly, undersized man. She was the taller, and quite possibly the stronger of the two. "Take off your hat, you blackguard, when you speak to a lady," she said, and tossed his hat in an instant across a ditch by which they were standing, into a pool on the other side. This time the spy was on his guard. He knew as well as Miss Gwilt knew the use which might be made of the precious minutes, if he turned his back on her and crossed the ditch to recover his hat. "It's well for you you're a woman," he said, standing scowling at her bareheaded in the fast darkening light. Miss Gwilt glanced sidelong down the onward vista of the road, and saw, through the gathering obscurity, the solitary figure of a man rapidly advancing toward her. Some women would have noticed the approach of a stranger at that hour, and in that lonely place, with a certain anxiety. Miss Gwilt was too confident in her own powers of persuasion not to count on the man's assistance beforehand, whoever he might be, because he was a man. She looked back at the spy with a redoubled confidence in herself, and measured him contemptuously from head to foot for the second time. "I wonder whether I'm strong enough to throw you after your hat," she said. "I'll take a turn and consider it." She sauntered on a few steps toward the figure advancing along the road. The spy followed her close. "Try it," he said brutally. "You're a fine woman. You're welcome to put your arms round me if you like." As the words escaped him, he too saw the stranger for the first time. He drew back a step and waited. Miss Gwilt, on her side, advanced a step and waited too. The stranger came on, with the lithe, light step of a practiced walker, swinging a stick in his hand and carrying a knapsack on his shoulders. A few paces nearer, and his face became visible. He was a dark man. His black hair was powdered with dust, and his black eyes were looking steadfastly forward along the road before him. Miss Gwilt advanced with the first signs of agitation she had shown yet. "Is it possible?" she said softly. "Can it really be you?" It was Midwinter, on his way back to Thorpe Ambrose after his fortnight among the Yorkshire moors. He stopped and looked at her in breathless surprise. The image of the woman had been in his thoughts at the moment when the woman herself spoke to him. "Miss Gwilt!" he exclaimed, and mechanically held out his hand. She took it and pressed it gently. "I should have been glad to see you at any time," she said. "You don't know how glad I am to see you now. May I trouble you to speak to that man? He's been following me, and annoying me all the way from the town." Midwinter stepped past her without uttering a word. Faint as the light was, the spy saw what was coming in his face, and turned instantly, leaped the ditch by the roadside. Before Midwinter could follow, Miss Gwilt's hand was on his shoulder. "No," she said, "you don't know who his employer is." Midwinter stopped and looked at her. "Strange things have happened since you left us," she went on. "I have been forced to give up my situation, and I am followed and watched by a paid spy. Don't ask who forced me out of my situation, and who pays the spy, at least not just yet. I can't make up my mind to tell you till I am a little more composed. Let the wretch go. Do you mind seeing me safe back to my lodging? It's in your way home. May I ask for the support of your arm? My little stock of courage is quite exhausted." She took his arm and clung close to it. The woman who had tyrannized over Mr. Bashwood was gone, and the woman who had tossed the spy's hat into the pool was gone. A timid, shrinking, interesting creature filled the fair skin and trembled on the symmetrical limbs of Miss Gwilt. She put her handkerchief to her eyes. "They say necessity has no law," she murmured faintly. "I'm treating you like an old friend. God knows I want one." They went on toward the town. She recovered herself with a touching fortitude.